The grease-stained coveralls hung loose on Sarah Chen's small frame as she emerged from beneath the lifted Honda Civic, wiping her hands on a rag that had seen better days. At 34, she moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had spent countless hours in automotive repair shops, her movements economical and precise. The other mechanics at Tony's Auto Repair barely glanced up as she wheeled the creeper back to its designated corner. Just another day for the quiet woman who kept to herself, and somehow always managed to diagnose problems that left others scratching their heads. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been working at Tony's for 3 years, ever since she drifted into the small industrial neighborhood on the outskirts of Phoenix with nothing but a duffel bag and an impressive knowledge of engines. Tony Marcelli, the shop's gruff owner, had been skeptical at first. Female mechanics weren't uncommon, but there was something about Sarah that didn't quite fit the typical mold. She was too quiet, too watchful, and when customers got aggressive or demanding, she had a way of looking at them that made even the loudest complainers suddenly find their manners. The morning started like any other in the sweltering Arizona heat. The shop's 3 bay doors were already open, letting in what little breeze existed at 7 in the morning. Sarah arrived precisely at opening time, as she had every day for 3 years, carrying her battered metal toolbox and wearing the same style of navy blue coveralls that had become her uniform. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the only jewelry she wore was a simple silver watch that looked military in its stark functionality. Tony was already in his office, visible through the glass partition that separated his domain from the work bays. At 62, he'd been running the shop for over 2 decades, building a reputation for honest work and fair prices in a neighborhood where both were often in short supply. He watched Sarah through the window as she began her routine inspection of the day's scheduled jobs, noting the methodical way she moved through the work orders. She never rushed, never seemed flustered, and somehow always finished her assignments ahead of schedule while maintaining quality that earned customer loyalty. The other mechanics were a mixed group that reflected the shop's blue-collar clientele. There was Miguel Rodriguez, a cheerful man in his late 20s who specialized in transmissions and had a tendency to narrate his work process out loud. His running commentary filled much of the shop's ambient noise, creating a steady stream of observations about whatever vehicle he was currently dissecting. Then there was Dave Peterson, a heavy-set man approaching 50 who handled most of the electrical work and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of automotive wiring systems that customers found both impressive and slightly intimidating. The newest addition to the team was Jake Williams, a recent trade school graduate who'd been hired 6 months earlier. At 23, Jake had the confidence of youth combined with just enough knowledge to be dangerous. He'd initially tried to impress Sarah with his theoretical understanding of modern fuel injection systems, only to watch in frustrated silence as she diagnosed and repaired complex problems using methods that weren't covered in any textbook he'd encountered. Sarah's workstation occupied the middle bay, positioned where she could observe both the entrance and the rear exit without seeming to pay attention to either. Her tools were arranged with mathematical precision, each item returning to its exact position after use. The casual observer might attribute this to simple professionalism, but there was something almost ritualistic about the way she maintained her equipment. Every wrench, every diagnostic tool, every piece of hardware had its designated place in a system that allowed her to locate any item within seconds, even in complete darkness. The morning's first customer arrived, while Sarah was reviewing the repair order for a 2018 Ford F-150 with transmission problems. Mrs. Henderson, a retired teacher who'd been bringing her various vehicles to Tony's for 15 years, pulled her aging Toyota Camry into the service area with the distinctive sound of brake pads that had worn past their useful life. She was a regular customer, the kind who trusted Tony's recommendation completely and never questioned estimates or repair timelines. Sarah emerged from the bay to greet her, pulling off her work gloves with practiced motions. Mrs. Henderson had specifically requested Sarah for this job, after the young mechanic had previously diagnosed a complex electrical issue that 2 other shops had failed to identify. There was something reassuring about Sarah's calm demeanor and the way she explained mechanical problems in clear, patient terms that made sense to non-automotive customers. The brake inspection revealed what Sarah had suspected from the sound. The pads were completely worn, The rotors were scored beyond resurfacing, and the brake fluid showed signs of contamination. It was a straightforward repair, but one that required immediate attention for safety reasons. Sarah provided Mrs. Henderson with a detailed estimate and timeline, explaining each component and its necessity without the condescending tone that often characterized interactions between mechanics and customers. As Mrs. Henderson departed, leaving her vehicle for the day's work, Sarah noticed the white panel van that had been parked across the street for the past hour. The vehicle itself wasn't unusual for the industrial neighborhood, but something about its positioning and the way its occupants seemed to be observing the shop triggered an awareness that had nothing to do with automotive repair. She made a mental note of the van's license plate and continued with her work, but a small part of her mind remained focused on the potential threat assessment. The morning progressed with typical shop rhythm. Miguel worked on rebuilding a transmission while maintaining his usual commentary about the manufacturer's design choices. Dave traced electrical gremlins through a maze of aftermarket modifications that had been installed by someone with more enthusiasm than expertise. Jake struggled with a diagnostic computer that seemed determined to provide cryptic error codes rather than useful information. Through it all, Sarah methodically worked through her assignments while maintaining peripheral awareness of everything happening around her. Tony emerged from his office around 10 o'clock, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who just finished dealing with parts suppliers. He paused at Sarah's workstation, watching as she carefully torqued the brake caliper bolts to manufacturer specifications. There was something almost meditative about the way she worked, each movement deliberate and efficient. In 3 years, he'd never seen her make a mistake or require a do-over on any repair. The conversation that followed was typical of their daily interactions. Tony inquired about progress on the day's jobs. Sarah provided concise updates on each vehicle's status, and both avoided the kind of personal discussion that might reveal more than either was comfortable sharing. It was a professional relationship built on mutual respect and the understanding that some questions didn't need to be asked. What Tony didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah's mechanical expertise represented only a small fraction of her actual skill set. The precision with which she organized her tools mirrored the discipline drilled into elite military units. The way she positioned herself to observe multiple exit routes reflected training that had nothing to do with automotive repair. The calm demeanor that customers found so reassuring was the result of experience in situations where panic meant death, and clear thinking was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The white van across the street had moved twice during the morning, each time maintaining visual contact with the shop while avoiding positions that might attract attention from law enforcement patrols. Sarah had noted each relocation without appearing to pay attention, her subconscious mind cataloging details that civilian observers would miss entirely. The van's occupants were conducting surveillance, but their amateur mistakes suggested they weren't law enforcement or intelligence professionals. That narrowed the possibilities considerably, none of them pleasant. Lunch break arrived with the desert heat reaching levels that made working in the open bays uncomfortable, even with industrial fans running at full speed. Miguel and Dave departed for a nearby sandwich shop, their usual routine involving complaints about the weather and speculation about afternoon baseball scores. Jake remained behind, using the time to study repair manuals and practice diagnostic procedures on vehicles that weren't currently generating billable hours. Sarah typically spent her lunch break in the small employee break room, eating the simple meal she brought from home while reviewing technical bulletins or catching up on industry publications. Today, however, she found herself drawn to the front of the shop, ostensibly checking inventory but actually maintaining observation of the suspicious van. The vehicle had returned to its original position, and thermal signatures visible through the windshield suggested 2 occupants who were taking turns watching the shop through binoculars. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, each presenting their own unique combination of mechanical problems and personal circumstances. There was the college student whose ancient Honda Accord needed creative solutions to keep it running on a minimal budget. The contractor whose work truck required repairs that would keep his business operational while managing costs that threatened his profit margins. The young mother whose minivan represented her family's only transportation and couldn't be out of service for more than a day. Sarah handled each interaction with the same professional courtesy, explaining problems clearly and providing options that balance necessary repairs with budget constraints. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What customers appreciated most was her honesty. She never recommended unnecessary work and often suggested maintenance that could prevent more expensive problems later. This approach had earned her a following among budget-conscious customers who specifically requested her services. The white van's continued presence was beginning to concern her, though she maintained her normal routine to avoid alerting its occupants to her awareness. Professional surveillance teams would have rotated vehicles and positions to prevent detection, but these observers seemed content to maintain their static position. Their lack of sophistication suggested they weren't government agents or corporate intelligence operatives, which meant they were likely connected to criminal activity. Late afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Detective Ray Martinez from the Phoenix Police Department. Sarah recognized him immediately, though they'd never been formally introduced. Martinez was a 20-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness and integrity, the kind of detective who took the time to understand cases completely rather than rushing toward quick resolutions. His presence at the shop could be routine, or could indicate that someone had noticed the surveillance activity. Martinez spoke briefly with Tony before making his way through the shop, ostensibly conducting a routine check on a community policing initiative, but actually observing the staff and operations with trained eyes. When he reached Sarah's workstation, his introduction was professional but carried an undertone that suggested he was aware of more than he was revealing. The conversation was brief and seemingly casual. Martinez inquired about how long Sarah had been working at the shop, whether she'd noticed any unusual activity in the neighborhood, and if she had any concerns about safety or security. Sarah's responses were equally professional, providing the information requested without volunteering additional details. Both participants understood they were engaged in a careful dance of information gathering disguised as community outreach. What Martinez didn't reveal was that Sarah Chen wasn't the name in the databases his department could access. The background check that Tony had performed when hiring her had returned clean results, but those results were the product of carefully constructed identity documentation that would satisfy casual scrutiny, while concealing a military service record that existed in classified systems far above local law enforcement clearance levels. As the detective departed, Sarah noticed increased activity around the white van. The vehicle's engine started, and she could see animated discussion between the occupants through the windshield. Martinez's presence had clearly concerned them, confirming her assessment that their surveillance was connected to criminal rather than official activity. The question was whether they were planning immediate action or simply conducting reconnaissance for future operations. The shop's closing routine began at 5:30, with each mechanic securing their work areas and tools according to established procedures. Miguel and Dave completed their final tasks with the efficiency of long practice, exchanging casual conversation about evening plans and weekend activities. Jake lingered longer, using the additional time to organize his workspace and review the technical manuals he'd been studying during lunch. Sarah's closing routine was more elaborate than her colleagues, though the additional steps appeared to be simple thoroughness rather than anything unusual. She methodically checked each tool in her collection, verified that all equipment was properly secured, and conducted a visual inspection of her work area that was actually a comprehensive threat assessment of the shop's security posture. Old habits from a different life expressing themselves through behaviors that appeared perfectly normal in civilian context. Tony locked the front office and armed the security system while the mechanics gathered their personal belongings and prepared to depart. The evening shift security guard, an elderly man named Frank who worked part-time to supplement his retirement income, would monitor the facility overnight. Frank's presence was more deterrent than actual security, but the neighborhood's low crime rate had made more sophisticated measures seem unnecessary. The parking lot behind the shop held the personal vehicles of the staff, a collection of older cars and trucks that reflected both the blue-collar income level and the professional preference for reliable transportation over flashy appearance. Sarah's vehicle was a 2015 Honda Civic that she'd purchased used and maintained in perfect mechanical condition. The car was unremarkable in every way, which was exactly how she preferred it. As Sarah approached her vehicle, she conducted the subtle inspection routine that had become second nature over the years. A quick visual check for signs of tampering, a careful look underneath for foreign objects, and a brief examination of the door handles and locks for evidence of attempted entry. The inspection appeared to be nothing more than the casual attention of someone who cared about their vehicle, but it was actually a comprehensive security assessment that would detect most surveillance devices or explosive threats. The white van remained in position across the street, its occupants apparently content to maintain their observation post as the shop's staff departed. Sarah started her Honda and pulled out of the parking lot with the unhurried movements of someone heading home after a routine day at work. Her route took her through the industrial district's main thoroughfare, past warehouses and distribution centers that were transitioning from day to evening shifts. 3 blocks from the shop, Sarah confirmed what she'd suspected. The white van was following her. The surveillance was amateur but persistent, maintaining a distance that kept her vehicle in sight while attempting to blend with normal traffic. Professional counter-surveillance training allowed her to track their position through multiple turns and lane changes without alerting them to her awareness of their presence. Her apartment was located in a modest complex 15 minutes from the shop, chosen specifically for its multiple exit routes and clear sightlines from the third-floor unit she'd selected. The building's layout provided strategic advantages that civilian residents would never consider, but which were crucial for someone whose past might eventually catch up with them. Sarah had learned long ago that paranoia was just another word for adequate preparation. The van followed her to within 2 blocks of the apartment complex before breaking off, apparently satisfied with confirming her residence location. Sarah continued home with heightened awareness, conducting additional security checks before entering her building. Her apartment was spartanly furnished, but strategically organized, with sight lines to all approaches and emergency plans for multiple contingencies. As evening settled over Phoenix, Sarah Chin sat at her kitchen table reviewing the day's events and planning for possibilities that her colleagues at Tony's Auto Repair couldn't imagine. The woman they knew as a skilled mechanic with an unusually calm demeanor was actually Master Sergeant Sarah Chin, formerly of the Army's 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, with a service record that included operations in 17 countries, and a collection of commendations that would never be publicly acknowledged. The transition from elite military operator to civilian mechanic had been carefully planned and methodically executed. The mechanical skills were real, developed during childhood spent in her father's garage, and refined through military training that emphasized equipment maintenance under impossible conditions. The quiet demeanor and professional competence were authentic personality traits that had served her well in both military and civilian contexts. But the surveillance activity suggested that her carefully constructed civilian identity might be under threat. The question was whether the interest in her was random criminal targeting or something more specific connected to her classified past. Either way, Sarah began making preparations that had nothing to do with automotive repair and everything to do with survival skills that most civilians would never need. The evening routine included exercises that maintained physical conditioning far beyond what was necessary for mechanical work, weapons maintenance for items that weren't visible to casual observation, and communication checks with contacts who existed in databases that local law enforcement couldn't access. Sarah Chin, the mechanic, was preparing for possibilities that Sarah Chin, the Delta Force operator, understood all too well. As Phoenix settled into its evening rhythm of traffic and activity, a white van sat in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant, 2 miles from Tony's Auto Repair. Its occupants were making phone calls and reviewing photographs taken throughout the day, planning an operation that would transform a routine automotive repair shop into the site of a confrontation that none of them were prepared for. Tomorrow would begin like any other day at Tony's, with familiar routines and expected challenges. But circumstances were already in motion that would reveal whether 3 years of civilian life had softened the edge that had once made Master Sergeant Sarah Chin one of the most effective special operations soldiers in American military history. The mechanics who had grown accustomed to her quiet competence were about to discover that their unassuming colleague possessed skills that extended far beyond automotive repair. The desert night settled over the industrial district with its characteristic dry heat and star-filled sky. At a modest apartment complex, a woman who had spent years in the world's most dangerous locations prepared for sleep while maintaining the alertness that had kept her alive through missions that existed only in classified files. Tomorrow would test whether the transition from warrior to civilian had been complete, or whether circumstances would demand that Master Sergeant Sarah Chin emerge from the carefully constructed identity of Sarah the mechanic. The next morning arrived with the pre-dawn coolness that Phoenix residents learned to appreciate, before the desert sun transformed the city into a furnace. Sarah's internal clock had awakened her at 5:15, a habit developed through years of military discipline that civilian life hadn't managed to alter. Her morning routine began with a comprehensive security check of the apartment, examining window locks, door frames, and the small telltales she'd positioned throughout the space to detect unauthorized entry. The drive to Tony's auto repair followed a deliberately varied route, one of 6 different paths she'd memorized during her first week of employment. Operational security demanded unpredictable patterns, and the surveillance from the previous day had elevated her threat assessment from routine caution to active concern. The white van was absent from its previous position, but that could indicate either abandonment of interest or evolution to more sophisticated observation methods. Tony's shop occupied a corner lot that had originally housed a tire installation center before the previous owner's retirement had created an opportunity for expansion and renovation. The building's concrete block construction and strategic positioning provided natural defensive advantages that Sarah had noted during her initial job interview, though she'd never expected to consider them operationally relevant. The neighborhood's industrial character meant that unusual activity often went unnoticed among the legitimate traffic of delivery trucks and service vehicles. Sarah arrived at precisely 7 o'clock, maintaining the punctuality that had become her trademark among the shop's staff. Miguel's transmission project from the previous day occupied the left bay, its components organized with the methodical precision of someone who understood that mechanical complexity demanded systematic approach. Dave's electrical diagnostic equipment filled the right bay, connected to a luxury sedan whose multiple computer modules had been generating fault codes that defied conventional troubleshooting methods. The Honda Civic she'd been working on sat completed in the center bay, its brake system restored to factory specifications and ready for Mrs. Henderson's afternoon pickup. Sarah conducted a final quality inspection of her work, checking torque specifications and brake fluid levels with the thoroughness that had earned customer loyalty over 3 years. Professional pride demanded perfection, but military training had made attention to detail a matter of survival instinct rather than simple craftsmanship. Jake arrived 15 minutes after opening time, carrying the large coffee cup that had become essential to his morning functionality. His tardiness was a source of ongoing irritation to Tony, though the young mechanic's enthusiasm and willingness to handle less desirable tasks had earned him grudging tolerance. Jake's theoretical knowledge from trade school often conflicted with the practical realities of automotive repair, creating teachable moments that Sarah had learned to navigate without damaging his confidence. The morning's first surprise came in the form of a phone call that Tony fielded in his office, his expression growing increasingly serious as the conversation progressed. Through the glass partition, Sarah could observe his body language transitioning from casual business discussion to something approaching alarm. When the call concluded, Tony emerged from his office wearing the expression of a man who'd just received news that would complicate his carefully organized day. The call had been from Detective Martinez requesting a meeting to discuss neighborhood security concerns that required immediate attention. The detective's tone had carried an urgency that suggested official police business rather than the community outreach visit from the previous day. Tony's experience with law enforcement interactions was limited to routine business license renewals and occasional traffic citations, making this request both unusual and concerning. Sarah continued her work on the day's scheduled repairs while monitoring Tony's obvious anxiety about the impending police visit. Her military background had taught her to compartmentalize concerns, focusing on immediate tasks while maintaining awareness of developing situations. The ability to function normally under stress was a skill that translated well from combat operations to civilian crisis management, though the stakes were considerably different. Miguel arrived with his characteristic cheerfulness intact, immediately launching into a detailed monologue about his previous evening's attempt to repair his neighbor's lawnmower. His mechanical narrative served as the shop's unofficial background soundtrack, providing a steady stream of technical commentary mixed with personal observations about the inherent perversity of mechanical systems. Most of the staff had learned to filter his constant chatter, but Sarah found his running commentary useful for monitoring the shop's general mood and activity level. Dave's entrance was marked by the careful placement of his extensive collection of diagnostic equipment, each tool positioned according to a system that made sense only to him. His approach to electrical problems resembled that of a detective investigating complex crimes, methodically eliminating possibilities until only the correct solution remained. The luxury sedan currently occupying his attention had been generating error codes for 3 different computer modules, creating a diagnostic puzzle that required both technical knowledge and creative problem-solving. The white van reappeared at 8:30, this time positioned behind a delivery truck that provided partial concealment while maintaining sightlines to the shop's entrance. Sarah noted its return without altering her work pattern, but began implementing subtle counter-surveillance measures that would help determine whether the observation was random criminal targeting or something more specific. The amateur nature of their positioning suggested local criminals rather than professional operatives, but assumptions could prove fatal in threat assessment situations. Detective Martinez arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, his unmarked police cruiser announcing his presence to both the shop's occupants and anyone conducting external surveillance. His approach to the building was measured and professional, but Sarah noticed the way his eyes swept the surrounding area before entering. Martinez had clearly identified the same surveillance activity that had concerned her, confirming that law enforcement was aware of unusual interest in the shop. The detective's conversation with Tony took place in the glass-walled office, visible to the shop's staff but not audible over the ambient noise of running equipment and Miguel's ongoing mechanical commentary. Tony's expression grew increasingly serious as Martinez spoke, occasionally glancing toward the work bays where his employees continued their assigned tasks. Whatever information the detective was sharing, it was significant enough to warrant law enforcement attention. Sarah positioned herself to observe both the office conversation and the white van's reaction to police presence. The surveillance vehicle's occupants were clearly agitated by Martinez's arrival, with visible movement and what appeared to be heated discussion between them. Professional criminals would have either withdrawn completely or maintained better operational discipline, reinforcing her assessment that these were local opportunists rather than sophisticated operators. The meeting concluded after 20 minutes, with Martinez departing through the front entrance while maintaining the alert posture of someone expecting potential threats. His final words to Tony were inaudible, but the shop owner's expression suggested he'd received information that required careful consideration. Tony remained in his office for several minutes after the detective's departure, making phone calls that appeared to involve family members based on his tone and gestures. When Tony finally emerged from his office, he gathered the shop's staff for an impromptu meeting that immediately elevated the tension level throughout the building. Sarah joined Miguel, Dave, and Jake near the center bay, noting how each man's body language reflected different levels of concern about the unexpected interruption to their normal routine. Military training had taught her to read group dynamics quickly, identifying potential stress reactions that could affect operational effectiveness. Tony's briefing was characteristically direct and unembellished. Detective Martinez had informed him that several auto repair shops in the surrounding area had been targeted by armed robbery crews over the past month. The criminals typically conducted surveillance for several days before striking, usually during afternoon hours when shops were most likely to have cash on hand from daily operations. 2 previous incidents had resulted in injuries to employees who'd attempted to resist the robberies. The information explained the white van's persistent observation, though it raised new questions about the timing and selection criteria for potential targets. Tony's shop maintained minimal cash on hand, with most transactions conducted through credit cards or checks that limited the appeal for robbery crews seeking immediate monetary gain. The criminals' interest suggested either poor intelligence gathering or additional motivations beyond simple theft. Sarah absorbed the briefing while conducting a mental threat assessment that drew upon experience with hostile environments far more dangerous than Phoenix auto repair shops. The criminal surveillance pattern indicated poor operational security and limited sophistication, but desperation or drug dependency could make even amateur criminals extremely dangerous. The shop's layout provided some defensive advantages, but protecting civilian employees would require careful planning and preparation. Tony's response to the threat was predictably pragmatic. He contacted a security company to arrange for installation of additional cameras and alarm systems, scheduled delivery of a safe for securing daily receipts, and implemented new procedures for limiting cash accumulation throughout the workday. These measures would reduce the shop's attractiveness as a robbery target while providing evidence for law enforcement if criminal activity occurred. Miguel's reaction to the security briefing was typical of his generally optimistic personality. He expressed confidence that the criminals would select easier targets and suggested that their obvious surveillance activity indicated incompetence that would lead to rapid police apprehension. His cheerful dismissal of the threat reflected either genuine courage or the kind of civilian naivety that could prove dangerous in crisis situations. Dave approached the security threat with the methodical analysis he applied to electrical problems, asking detailed questions about the previous robberies and developing theories about the criminal's selection criteria. His technical background made him naturally inclined toward systematic problem-solving, though his suggested solutions focused on electronic security measures rather than tactical considerations that might prove more immediately useful. Jake's response revealed both youthful bravado and genuine concern about the implications of armed robbery for his developing career. His questions centered on employee safety protocols and whether the shop's insurance coverage would provide adequate protection for staff members injured during criminal activity. The combination of inexperience and anxiety made him the most unpredictable element in any potential crisis situation. Sarah's public response was measured and professional, asking practical questions about communication procedures and evacuation routes while avoiding any suggestions that might reveal her military background. Privately, she was already developing tactical assessments and response options that reflected special operations training rather than civilian security planning. The gap between her apparent capabilities and actual skills would become crucial if the surveillance escalated to direct action. The remainder of the morning proceeded with heightened awareness throughout the shop, though work continued on scheduled repairs and maintenance. Sarah completed the brake system installation on Mrs. Anderson's Toyota while monitoring the white van's continued presence and noting subtle changes in its occupants' behavior patterns. The vehicle had relocated twice since Detective Martinez's departure, suggesting increased nervousness about police attention. Lunch break brought an unexpected development when Miguel announced his intention to confront the surveillance team directly. His plan involved walking across the street and demanding an explanation for their continued observation of the shop, an approach that combined admirable courage with potentially catastrophic tactical stupidity. Sarah intervened with careful suggestions about allowing law enforcement to handle the situation, though she had to balance discouragement of civilian heroics with maintaining her own cover identity. The afternoon's customer traffic included several regular clients who had heard rumors about criminal activity affecting local businesses. Mrs. Henderson expressed concern about safety when she arrived to collect her repaired vehicle, leading to a conversation about precautionary measures that customers should consider when visiting automotive shops. Sarah provided practical advice about situational awareness, while avoiding any suggestions that might indicate specialized security training. Tony's anxiety about the ongoing surveillance was affecting his ability to concentrate on normal business operations, creating an atmosphere of tension that permeated the entire shop. His phone calls to the security company had revealed that installation of new equipment would require several days, leaving the business vulnerable during the period when criminal interest appeared to be escalating. The timing gap between threat identification and protective implementation was a classic security challenge with no ideal solutions. Dave's electrical diagnostic work had revealed that the luxury sedan's computer problems stemmed from a sophisticated aftermarket modification system that had been improperly installed by a previous shop. The repair would require specialized equipment and extensive labor, creating a high-value target for criminals who might assume expensive vehicles indicated corresponding cash transactions. Sarah made note of the potential complication while continuing her own work assignments. The white van's behavior pattern changed noticeably during the afternoon, with increased movement and apparent communication activity suggesting preparation for some kind of action. Sarah observed the changes while maintaining her normal work routine but began implementing subtle preparations that would provide tactical advantages if the situation escalated beyond surveillance. Her tool arrangement shifted slightly to provide quicker access to potential improvised weapons, and her positioning offered clear sightlines to all approaches. Jake's nervousness about the security threat was beginning to affect his work quality, resulting in diagnostic errors and procedural mistakes that required correction and supervision. His anxiety was understandable given his limited experience with crisis situations, but it created additional stress for Tony, who was already struggling to maintain normal operations under abnormal circumstances. Sarah found herself providing subtle guidance and reassurance, while avoiding any actions that might reveal her own lack of concern about the threat. Miguel's transmission rebuild project had reached a critical phase requiring precise assembly techniques and careful attention to torque specifications. His usual running commentary had decreased as concentration demands increased, creating an unusual quiet in the normally chatty atmosphere. The change in ambient noise level made surveillance of external activity easier, though it also contributed to the overall tension affecting everyone in the shop. Detective Martinez returned for a brief afternoon visit, ostensibly to check on implementation of suggested security measures but actually to assess the continued criminal surveillance activity. His conversation with Tony was shorter than the morning meeting, but Sarah noticed increased attention to the shop's layout and defensive capabilities. The detective's professional assessment was clearly reaching conclusions similar to her own tactical evaluation. The afternoon brought news that another auto repair shop had been robbed during lunch break, with 2 employees hospitalized after attempting to resist the armed criminals. The incident had occurred only 6 blocks from Tony's location, confirming that the threat was both immediate and geographically focused. Tony's stress level increased visibly as he absorbed the implications for his own business and staff safety. Sarah's analysis of the criminal pattern suggested that the robberies were following a systematic approach to target selection and timing. The criminals appeared to be working from a predetermined list of potential targets, conducting surveillance to identify optimal approach and escape routes before executing their operations. Tony's shop was likely scheduled for attention within the next few days based on the escalating surveillance activity. The security company representative arrived late in the afternoon to conduct a preliminary assessment for camera and alarm installation. His recommendations included comprehensive coverage of all approaches and entry points, integration with existing electrical systems, and coordination with local law enforcement monitoring systems. The proposed timeline would leave the shop vulnerable for at least 72 hours, a gap that concerned everyone involved in the planning process. As closing time approached, tension throughout the shop had reached levels that were affecting normal operations and employee morale. Tony made the decision to implement early closure procedures and suggested that staff members leave together rather than maintaining individual departure schedules. The group departure would provide mutual security while demonstrating to potential criminals that the business was aware of the threat and taking appropriate precautions. Sarah's closing routine included additional security measures that appeared to be simple thoroughness but actually constituted comprehensive threat assessment and tactical preparation. Her tool inventory included items that could serve dual purposes if circumstances required improvised defensive measures, and her equipment placement provided strategic advantages that civilian observers wouldn't recognize. Years of military training had taught her that preparation was the key to survival in hostile environments. The parking lot departure became an inadvertent tactical exercise, as the staff attempted to leave simultaneously while maintaining awareness of potential threats. Miguel's natural leadership qualities emerged as he coordinated the group movement, though his suggestions reflected civilian thinking rather than tactical doctrine. Sarah provided subtle guidance while avoiding any actions that might indicate specialized training or experience with hostile environments. The white van's response to the early closure was immediate and obvious, with visible agitation among its occupants and rapid communication activity that suggested reporting to outside coordinators. Sarah noted their reaction while departing with her colleagues, confirming her assessment that the surveillance was preparation for imminent criminal action rather than casual observation. The criminals' poor operational discipline would work in favor of any defensive response, but civilian casualties remained a primary concern. The drive home took Sarah through a route designed to identify any following vehicles while appearing to be random traffic navigation. The white van didn't attempt pursuit, suggesting that the criminals' focus remained on the shop itself rather than individual employees. This pattern was consistent with robbery crews who targeted business locations rather than personal residences, though it didn't eliminate the possibility of expanded criminal interest. Her apartment building's security arrangements had been selected specifically for their defensive advantages, though none of the other residents were aware of the tactical considerations that had influenced her housing choice. The third-floor unit provided elevation advantages and multiple escape routes, while the building's layout offered clear sightlines for threat assessment and early warning capabilities. 3 years of civilian life hadn't diminished her appreciation for strategic positioning. The evening news confirmed that criminal activity was escalating throughout the industrial district, with law enforcement resources stretched thin by the scope and intensity of the robbery pattern. Detective Martinez appeared in a brief interview, warning business owners to implement security measures and coordinate with police authorities rather than attempting to handle threats independently. His message was clearly directed toward civilians who might consider armed resistance without proper training or tactical support. Sarah's evening routine included maintenance activities that had nothing to do with automotive repair and everything to do with skills that most civilians would never need. Her physical conditioning regimen was designed to maintain capabilities that extended far beyond what was necessary for mechanical work, and her equipment inventory included items that weren't visible to casual observation, but would prove essential if circumstances demanded tactical response. The classified communication equipment hidden in her apartment allowed contact with networks that existed far above local law enforcement clearance levels, though she had hoped never to need such resources again. The transition from elite military operator to civilian mechanic had been carefully planned as a permanent retirement from the world of special operations, but circumstances were suggesting that her past might soon become operationally relevant again. As Phoenix settled into its evening rhythm, criminal elements were making final preparations for operations that would test whether 3 years of civilian life had softened the tactical edge that had once made Master Sergeant Sarah Chen one of the most effective special operations soldiers in American military history. Tomorrow would determine whether the woman her colleagues knew as a skilled mechanic could successfully protect them from threats they were completely unprepared to face. The third day dawned with an oppressive humidity that clung to Phoenix like a wet blanket, unusual for the desert climate and adding to the general sense of unease that had settled over the industrial district. Sarah's morning security assessment revealed subtle changes in the neighborhood's pattern of activity. Several businesses had implemented early closure policies, delivery schedules had been adjusted to avoid afternoon hours, and the usual flow of pedestrian traffic had diminished noticeably as word spread about the escalating robbery incidents. Tony's Auto Repair opened with visible signs of heightened security awareness. New temporary cameras had been hastily installed at the front entrance and rear exit, their obvious placement serving as much to deter criminal activity as to record it. Tony himself appeared to have slept poorly, his usually neat appearance showing signs of stress, and his normal, confident demeanor replaced by anxious vigilance that affected the entire staff's morale. Sarah arrived to find the white van absent from its previous surveillance positions, a development that could indicate either abandonment of criminal interest or evolution to more sophisticated observation methods. Military experience had taught her that disappearing threats were often more dangerous than visible ones, requiring heightened alertness rather than reduced concern. The absence of obvious surveillance didn't eliminate the danger. It merely changed the tactical parameters. The morning's work schedule included completion of Dave's complex electrical diagnostic project, a transmission service for a commercial delivery vehicle, and routine maintenance on several customer cars that represented the shop's bread-and-butter income. Normal business operations continued despite the security concerns, though each staff member approached their tasks with obvious tension that affected both efficiency and workplace atmosphere. Miguel's usual cheerful commentary had been replaced by nervous jokes and frequent glances toward the shop's entrances. His transmission expertise remained unaffected by stress, but his social function as the group's morale booster was compromised by anxiety that he couldn't completely conceal. The change in his behavior created a ripple effect throughout the shop, removing a source of levity that had previously helped maintain normal working conditions. Dave's methodical approach to problem-solving had intensified to near-obsessive levels as he focused on completing the luxury sedan's electrical repairs. His concentration served as both professional dedication and psychological escape from security concerns that he felt powerless to address. The complex diagnostic work required absolute attention to detail, providing a mental refuge from circumstances beyond his technical expertise. Jake's nervousness had evolved into hypervigilance that was beginning to affect his work quality and decision-making abilities. His youth and inexperience with crisis situations made him the most unpredictable variable in any potential confrontation, though his eagerness to prove himself could prove either beneficial or catastrophic depending on circumstances. Sarah made note of his condition while developing contingency plans that accounted for various stress reactions. The morning brought an unexpected visit from Mrs. Henderson, who arrived not for automotive service but to express concern about the shop's safety and the well-being of its employees. Her maternal instincts had been triggered by news reports about local crime, and she'd brought homemade cookies along with offers to provide any assistance the staff might need. Her genuine care for people she'd come to know through years of business relationships provided a brief respite from the prevailing tension. Tony's conversation with Mrs. Henderson revealed the depth of his concern for both his business and his employees' safety. His responsibility for their welfare weighed heavily on his mind, creating stress that went beyond financial considerations to encompass genuine fear for people he'd come to regard as extended family. The burden of leadership in crisis situations was testing his normally steady demeanor in ways that routine business challenges never had. The security company representative returned for installation of the permanent camera system, his presence adding both reassurance and reminder that the threat was serious enough to warrant significant defensive measures. His work required several hours of disruption to normal operations, creating additional stress for Tony, who was struggling to balance security needs with business continuity. The installation process itself created temporary vulnerabilities that Sarah noted for tactical planning purposes. Detective Martinez's mid-morning visit carried an urgency that hadn't been present in his previous contacts with the shop. His briefing included news that the robbery crew had struck twice during the previous evening, escalating their operational tempo in ways that suggested either increased desperation or growing confidence. The pattern indicated systematic clearing of targets from a predetermined list, making it likely that Tony's shop would face attention within the immediate future. The detective's tactical advice focused on passive resistance and immediate compliance with criminal demands, standard law enforcement guidance designed to minimize civilian casualties during robbery incidents. His recommendations were sound for typical citizens facing armed criminals, but Sarah recognized that his assumptions about defensive capabilities didn't account for variables he couldn't know existed. Her response to his briefing was appropriately civilian, while concealing tactical assessments that reflected entirely different training and experience. Martinez's departure was followed by a shop meeting that revealed the full extent of Tony's concern for his employees' safety. His announcement that he was considering temporary closure until law enforcement resolved the criminal threat demonstrated both leadership responsibility and the economic reality that small businesses faced when confronted with security challenges beyond their resources. The proposal generated mixed reactions from staff members who balanced safety concerns against financial necessity. Miguel's response reflected his role as the shop's informal spokesman and his natural optimism about human nature. He argued for remaining open while implementing reasonable precautions, expressing confidence that criminals would eventually be apprehended and that surrendering to fear would represent victory for lawlessness. His position was emotionally appealing but tactically naive, demonstrating civilian thinking about confrontation that could prove dangerous. Dave's analytical approach led him to support temporary closure based on risk assessment calculations that treated the situation as an engineering problem with quantifiable variables. His systematic evaluation of costs versus benefits reached logical conclusions about minimizing exposure to unacceptable threats, though his analysis didn't account for tactical responses that might alter the fundamental parameters of confrontation. Jake's position reflected both financial necessity and youthful confidence in his ability to handle dangerous situations. His arguments for remaining open included suggestions for defensive measures that demonstrated more enthusiasm than tactical understanding, though his willingness to face risk showed courage that could prove valuable if properly directed. Sarah made note of his attitude while continuing to develop contingency plans. The lunch break brought news that criminal activity had expanded beyond simple robbery to include assault charges and destruction of property, indicating escalation that law enforcement was struggling to contain. The pattern suggested either drug-fueled desperation or criminal elements with more complex motivations than simple theft. Either scenario increased the danger to civilian employees who lacked training for violent confrontations. Sarah's lunch routine included discreet reconnaissance of the neighborhood's current security posture, observing changes in business operations and law enforcement presence that might affect tactical considerations. Her assessment revealed increased police patrols but inadequate coverage for the geographical area and business density involved. The criminal crew's operational tempo was exceeding law enforcement's ability to provide effective protection. The afternoon brought the white van's return, though its positioning and occupant behavior indicated significant changes in surveillance methodology. The vehicle now maintained greater distance while using multiple observation points, suggesting either improved tradecraft or guidance from more experienced criminal elements. Sarah noted the evolution while implementing counter-surveillance measures that appeared to be routine work activities. Tony's decision to remain open was announced after lunch, accompanied by implementation of additional security protocols that included employee check-in procedures, restricted cash handling, and emergency communication systems. His compromise between business necessity and safety concerns reflected the difficult balance that small business owners faced when confronted with threats beyond their control. The measures were reasonable but insufficient for the level of danger that Sarah's tactical assessment indicated. The afternoon's customer traffic included several regular clients who had heard about local criminal activity and expressed concern for the shop's safety. Their conversations revealed community awareness of the threat and support for local businesses, but also demonstrated civilian vulnerability to criminal elements who operated without regard for law enforcement or social consequences. The community's helplessness in the face of organized criminal activity was both touching and tactically irrelevant. Dave's completion of the luxury sedan's electrical repairs provided a sense of professional accomplishment that temporarily overshadowed security concerns, though the high-profile vehicle's presence in the shop created additional tactical complications. Expensive cars suggested wealthy customers and potentially significant cash transactions, making the shop a more attractive target for criminals seeking maximum return on their risk investment. Sarah made note of the additional complication while continuing her normal work assignments. The security camera installation was completed by mid-afternoon, providing Tony with real-time monitoring capabilities that offered both reassurance and stark reminder of the need for such measures. The system's effectiveness would depend on response times and criminal behavior patterns, neither of which could be predicted with certainty. Electronic security measures were useful but insufficient for confrontations involving armed criminals with nothing to lose. Miguel's afternoon work on a commercial truck's transmission provided both professional challenge and psychological distraction from mounting tension throughout the shop. His expertise with complex mechanical systems remained unaffected by stress, though his usual verbal commentary had been replaced by focused concentration that reflected everyone's heightened alertness. The change in atmosphere was affecting even the most optimistic staff members. Jake's assignment to routine maintenance tasks was designed to keep him occupied while limiting his exposure to high-value repair work that might attract criminal attention. His nervous energy was channeled into detailed cleaning and organization activities that provided both practical benefit and stress relief. Tony's protective instincts toward his youngest employee were affecting work assignments in ways that reflected paternal concern rather than business efficiency. The white van's repositioning during the afternoon indicated preparation for action rather than continued surveillance, with occupant behavior suggesting final reconnaissance before operational execution. Sarah observed the changes while maintaining her normal work routine, but began implementing subtle tactical preparations that would provide advantages if the situation escalated to direct confrontation. Her tool arrangement shifted to provide access to improvised weapons, and her positioning offered optimal sight lines to all approaches. Detective Martinez's third visit of the day brought news that law enforcement had identified members of the robbery crew and issued warrants for their apprehension, though the suspects remained at large and were considered armed and extremely dangerous. His warning included specific descriptions of the criminals and their vehicle, confirming Sarah's identification of the surveillance team, while providing additional intelligence about their capabilities and desperation level. The detective's tactical briefing emphasized immediate compliance with criminal demands and cooperation with robbery attempts, standard guidance that reflected law enforcement's priority for civilian safety over property protection. His recommendations were appropriate for typical citizens, but didn't account for defensive capabilities that existed beyond normal parameters. Sarah's response was appropriately civilian, while concealing tactical assessments that reflected entirely different training and experience. Tony's reaction to the identification of specific criminal suspects included both relief that law enforcement was making progress and increased anxiety about immediate threat levels. The knowledge that armed criminals were actively targeting his business for robbery created stress that affected his decision-making and leadership abilities. His responsibility for employee safety was weighing heavily on his mind as circumstances moved beyond his experience and control. The afternoon's final customer was a nervous businessman whose expensive German sedan required diagnostic work that would keep it overnight, creating additional tactical complications for the shop's security posture. High-value vehicles attracted criminal attention and suggested wealthy customers who might carry significant cash or valuables. Tony's reluctance to accept the work reflected growing awareness of factors beyond normal business considerations. As closing time approached, tension throughout the shop had reached levels that were affecting basic operations and employee morale. Tony's implementation of group departure procedures reflected both security consciousness and recognition that individual employees were vulnerable to criminal targeting. The coordinated exit strategy provided mutual protection while demonstrating awareness of threat conditions that required defensive measures. Sarah's closing routine included comprehensive tactical preparation disguised as normal equipment maintenance and workspace organization. Her tool selection and placement provided access to improvised weapons and defensive equipment that civilian observers wouldn't recognize. Years of military training had taught her that survival in hostile environments required constant preparation for confrontation, even when circumstances appeared routine. The parking lot departure became a tactical exercise as staff members attempted to leave simultaneously while maintaining awareness of potential threats. Miguel's natural leadership qualities emerged as he coordinated the group movement, though his suggestions reflected civilian thinking rather than tactical doctrine. Sarah provided subtle guidance while avoiding actions that might reveal specialized training or experience with hostile environments. The white van's absence from visible surveillance positions didn't reduce Sarah's threat assessment, though it appeared to provide psychological relief for her colleagues, who interpreted the lack of obvious observation as reduced danger. Military experience had taught her that invisible threats were often more dangerous than visible ones, requiring increased rather than decreased alertness. The criminal's disappearance likely indicated preparation for action rather than abandonment of criminal intent. Her drive home followed a deliberately complex route designed to identify following vehicles while appearing to be routine traffic navigation. The absence of obvious pursuit suggested that criminal focus remained concentrated on the business location rather than individual employees, though it didn't eliminate the possibility of expanded targeting. Professional criminals often escalated their activities when law enforcement pressure increased, creating unpredictable threat patterns. The evening news confirmed that criminal activity throughout the industrial district had reached levels that were overwhelming law enforcement resources and terrorizing the business community. Detective Martinez appeared in another interview, warning citizens to avoid confronting armed criminals and emphasizing the priority of personal safety over property protection. His message reflected both professional responsibility and recognition that civilian resistance could prove catastrophically dangerous. Sarah's evening routine included preparation activities that had nothing to do with automotive repair and everything to do with skills that most civilians would never need. Her physical conditioning regimen maintained capabilities that extended far beyond what was necessary for mechanical work, and her equipment inventory included items that weren't visible to casual observation but would prove essential if circumstances demanded tactical response. The classified communication equipment hidden in her apartment allowed contact with networks that existed far above local law enforcement clearance levels, though activating such resources would compromise the civilian identity she'd carefully constructed over 3 years. The decision to reveal her military background would have consequences that extended far beyond immediate circumstances, potentially ending her successful transition to civilian life. As Phoenix settled into its evening activities, criminal elements were completing final preparations for operations that would test whether 3 years of civilian life had diminished the tactical capabilities that had once made Master Sergeant Sarah Chen one of the most effective special operations soldiers in American military history. The morning would bring confrontation that would force her to choose between maintaining her cover identity and protecting colleagues who had no idea they were about to face threats completely beyond their experience or training. The night passed with unusual quiet in the industrial district, a calm that experienced operators recognized as the prelude to violent action. Criminal crews often conducted their operations during the transition between night and day shifts, using the confusion of changing personnel and routine modifications to their advantage. Sarah's internal clock awakened her before dawn with the certainty that the day would bring the confrontation that had been building through careful surveillance and escalating criminal activity. Her morning preparation included tactical considerations that went far beyond normal work requirements, though her civilian colleagues would interpret her actions as simple thoroughness and professional dedication. The woman they knew as a skilled mechanic with unusual attention to detail was actually a highly trained special operations soldier preparing for combat in an environment where her primary mission would be protecting civilians who had no idea they were about to become casualties in a confrontation they couldn't possibly understand. The morning erupted into chaos at exactly 11:47 when 3 armed men burst through Tony's front entrance with weapons drawn and faces covered by ski masks. Sarah was underneath a Ford pickup truck checking suspension components when the sound of splintering glass and shouted commands shattered the normal rhythm of automotive repair work. Her body reacted before her mind fully processed the situation, muscle memory from years of combat operations taking control as she rolled silently from beneath the vehicle. Miguel dropped his transmission tools with a metallic crash that echoed through the suddenly silent bay, his face draining of color as he found himself staring down the barrel of a pistol held by a man whose hands shook with nervous energy. The cheerful mechanic who had spent 3 years providing running commentary on every repair job was struck speechless by the reality of armed robbery, his optimistic faith in human nature colliding with criminal violence in ways his experience couldn't process. Dave froze completely behind his diagnostic equipment, his methodical mind struggling to categorize the chaos into manageable components that could be systematically addressed. The electrical systems he understood so thoroughly operated according to predictable laws of physics, but armed criminals followed no logical patterns that his analytical approach could decipher. His total immobility was both self-preservation instinct and complete inability to function outside his area of expertise. Jake raised his hands reflexively while backing toward the rear exit, his youth and inexperience with violence making him the most likely to panic or attempt something heroically stupid. The trade school education that had prepared him for automotive careers had included no training for confronting armed criminals, leaving him completely dependent on instincts that were more likely to escalate danger than reduce it. His wide eyes darted between the gunman and potential escape routes with obvious terror. Tony emerged from his office at the sound of breaking glass, only to be immediately forced against the wall by the second gunman, whose weapon remained steady despite the adrenaline that was affecting his partners. The shop owner's protective instincts toward his employees warred with practical recognition that resistance would likely result in casualties he couldn't accept. His face reflected the agonizing realization that his worst fears were becoming reality in ways he was powerless to prevent. The lead gunman was a thin man in his 30s whose visible tattoos and nervous mannerisms suggested drug dependency that made him unpredictable and dangerous beyond normal criminal parameters. His demands for cash and valuables were delivered in rapid-fire bursts that indicated both desperation and familiarity with robbery procedures, though his obvious agitation suggested this crew was operating beyond their usual comfort zone. The weapon in his hands trembled slightly with chemical withdrawal or stress-induced adrenaline. Sarah remained motionless beneath the pickup truck, her position providing both concealment and tactical advantage, while she assessed the situation and developed response options. 3 armed suspects with handguns, nervous behavior indicating possible drug impairment, poor tactical positioning that left them vulnerable to coordinated counterattack. Her military training automatically cataloged their weaknesses while calculating optimal response strategies that would neutralize threats while minimizing civilian casualties. The second gunman was larger and appeared more experienced with violent confrontation, his weapon discipline and positioning suggesting either law enforcement background or extensive criminal experience. His calm demeanor provided stability for the operation, while his systematic approach to securing the scene indicated someone who understood the tactical requirements of successful robbery. This man was the primary threat and would require immediate neutralization if resistance became necessary. The third criminal remained near the entrance as lookout, his attention divided between external security and internal control in ways that created exploitable vulnerabilities. His obvious nervousness and frequent glances toward the street suggested either inexperience with armed robbery or awareness that law enforcement response might be imminent. The positioning left him isolated from his partners and unable to provide immediate support if confrontation developed. Tony's compliance with demands for cash and keys bought precious time while Sarah maneuvered into better tactical position, using the shop's equipment and vehicle placement to approach from an angle that wouldn't be anticipated by criminals focused on obvious threats. Her movement was silent and deliberate, each step calculated to avoid detection, while positioning for actions that her civilian colleagues couldn't imagine their quiet mechanic was capable of executing. The lead gunman's growing agitation was creating instability in the criminal operation, as his demands became increasingly erratic and his weapon handling more dangerous. Drug withdrawal, or natural nervousness, was affecting his decision-making in ways that increased threat levels for everyone in the shop, making immediate intervention necessary before the situation escalated beyond control. Sarah recognized the signs of impending violence and prepared to act. Miguel's attempt to retrieve his wallet from a workbench drawer triggered an explosion of shouted threats from the second gunman, whose professional demeanor cracked to reveal underlying violence that had been carefully controlled until that moment. The mechanic's innocent movement was interpreted as potential resistance, escalating tension throughout the scene in ways that brought the confrontation to its critical decision point. Sarah knew the window for peaceful resolution had closed. The tactical situation crystallized in the moment when Jake made his move toward the rear exit, drawing the attention of all 3 gunmen and creating the distraction Sarah needed to begin her counterattack. The young mechanic's flight instinct had inadvertently provided operational cover for actions that would transform a routine robbery into a demonstration of combat skills that none of the participants expected to encounter in an automotive repair shop. Sarah emerged from concealment with fluid motion that placed her behind the nearest gunman before he could react to her presence, her arms snaking around his throat in a blood choke that rendered him unconscious within seconds. The weapon fell from his nerveless fingers as his body went limp, the first criminal neutralized without alerting his partners to the changed tactical situation. Years of close-quarters combat training had taught her that speed and silence were essential elements of successful room clearing. The second gunman's awareness of his partner's collapse came too late to prevent Sarah's follow-up attack, a precisely targeted strike to his elbow that disabled his gun arm, while her other hand stripped the weapon from his grasp. The disarming technique was executed with practiced efficiency that spoke of extensive training in weapons retention and tactical disarmament, skills that went far beyond anything civilian self-defense courses would provide. The criminal's shocked expression reflected complete inability to process what was happening. The lookout's delayed reaction to his partner's neutralization gave Sarah the time needed to secure his weapon through a combination of misdirection and overwhelming force application that left him face down on the shop floor with his hands secured behind his back. The entire engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds, transforming three armed criminals from predators into captives through the application of combat skills that her colleagues had never suspected existed beneath her mechanic's coveralls. Miguel stared in complete bewilderment at the scene before him, his understanding of reality struggling to incorporate the transformation of his quiet colleague into someone who moved with lethal precision and tactical awareness that belonged in military operations rather than automotive repair shops. The cheerful mechanic who had worked beside Sarah for 3 years was discovering that he had never really known her at all, that the woman who diagnosed transmission problems with methodical patience was also capable of neutralizing armed threats with professional efficiency. Dave's analytical mind was attempting to process variables that didn't fit any logical framework he could construct, watching as Sarah secured the scene with movements that indicated extensive training in tactical operations and crisis management. Her systematic approach to prisoner restraint and evidence preservation demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond civilian experience, revealing capabilities that transformed his understanding of his colleague's background and qualifications. Jake remained frozen near the rear exit, his planned escape forgotten in the face of witnessing combat skills that belonged in action movies rather than real-life automotive repair shops. The young mechanic's worldview was struggling to incorporate the reality that the woman he'd considered a maternal figure with outdated training methods was actually a highly skilled operator whose true capabilities were beyond anything he'd imagined possible. Tony's relief at the immediate threat's neutralization was accompanied by dawning recognition that his employee's response to the crisis revealed training and experience that didn't match her official background or civilian persona. The shop owner, who had valued Sarah's mechanical expertise and steady temperament, was discovering that her qualifications extended into areas that raised questions about her past and the circumstances that had brought her to his small automotive repair business. Sarah's post-engagement protocol included securing all weapons, checking the criminals for additional threats, and establishing communication with law enforcement while maintaining tactical awareness of potential backup or additional criminal elements. Her movements reflected standard operating procedures that were automatic responses developed through extensive military training rather than civilian self-defense courses. The gap between her apparent background and demonstrated capabilities was becoming impossible to conceal. The arrival of Detective Martinez and patrol units occurred within minutes of Sarah's emergency call, their response time suggesting either fortunate positioning or monitoring systems that had detected the criminal activity. Martinez's expression upon surveying the scene reflected both professional appreciation for the tactical execution and growing suspicion about the identity and background of the mechanic, who had single-handedly neutralized 3 armed criminals without sustaining casualties or allowing escape. The detective's preliminary questioning revealed Sarah's careful preparation of explanations that would satisfy immediate law enforcement requirements while avoiding details that might compromise her civilian identity. Her responses demonstrated familiarity with legal procedures and evidence preservation that suggested either extensive civilian training or professional experience with similar situations. Martinez noted the inconsistencies while respecting her obvious competence in crisis management. The criminal's condition upon regaining consciousness included injuries consistent with professional restraint techniques rather than random violence, indicating Sarah's training emphasized control and neutralization rather than excessive force application. Their weapons had been secured and rendered safe according to proper procedures, and their restraint showed knowledge of methods that would prevent escape while avoiding unnecessary injury. The execution reflected military training rather than civilian self-defense. Miguel's attempts to understand what he had witnessed led to questions that Sarah deflected with practiced ease, though her colleagues' growing awareness of her hidden capabilities was creating complications that would require careful management. The cheerful mechanic's worldview had been fundamentally altered by witnessing combat skills that belonged in special operations rather than automotive repair, leaving him struggling to reconcile 3 years of working alongside someone whose true identity he was only beginning to suspect. Dave's analytical approach to the morning's events was generating theories about Sarah's background that moved far beyond civilian automotive training, though his questions remained cautious and respectful of personal privacy boundaries. The methodical technician who specialized in complex electrical systems was applying the same systematic thinking to human puzzles that proved equally challenging to decode. His growing suspicion was tempered by professional respect for capabilities that had protected everyone in the shop. Jake's hero worship was beginning to replace his previous casual dismissal of Sarah's advice and instruction, though his questions about her background remained carefully indirect out of respect for obvious privacy concerns. The young mechanic was discovering that the woman whose worn tools and patient teaching methods he had considered outdated possessed skills that represented the pinnacle of professional training and operational experience. Tony's gratitude for his employees' safety was accompanied by recognition that Sarah's response to the crisis had revealed capabilities that didn't match her official employment record or the background information she'd provided during the hiring process. The shop owner, who had appreciated her mechanical expertise and steady temperament, was beginning to understand that his most reliable employee possessed qualifications that extended far beyond automotive repair into areas that suggested entirely different career backgrounds. The afternoon brought a parade of law enforcement officials and reporters drawn by news of the dramatic confrontation, creating complications that Sarah managed with the same professional competence she applied to mechanical problems. Her interactions with media representatives revealed media training that civilian mechanics wouldn't typically possess, while her coordination with investigating officers demonstrated familiarity with law enforcement procedures that suggested either extensive civilian involvement or professional experience. As the shop returned to some semblance of normal operations, Sarah's colleagues found themselves working alongside someone whose true identity remained mysterious, despite 3 years of daily interaction. The woman they had known as a competent mechanic with unusual attention to detail had revealed herself as someone whose capabilities extended into areas that raised fascinating questions about her past and the circumstances that had brought her to Tony's auto repair. The evening news coverage would transform the quiet mechanic into a local hero, though Sarah's careful management of media attention would limit the personal details that might compromise the civilian identity she had worked so hard to establish. The woman her colleagues were beginning to suspect might have military training would continue working alongside them, though their relationship would never again be quite the same after witnessing capabilities that belonged in elite military units rather than neighborhood automotive shops. 3 months after the robbery attempt, Tony's auto repair had returned to its familiar rhythm, though the dynamics between the staff had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Sarah still arrived precisely at 7 each morning, still organized her tools with mathematical precision, and still approached every repair with the methodical patience that had earned customer loyalty. But the respectful distance her colleagues now maintained carried acknowledgement of capabilities they were only beginning to understand. Miguel's cheerful commentary had resumed its normal volume and frequency, though his jokes about Sarah's meticulous habits had been replaced by genuine appreciation for precision that might represent life-or-death discipline rather than simple perfectionism. The transmission specialist, who had once teased her about excessive preparation, now watched her work with curiosity about training that went far beyond automotive certification. His questions remained carefully indirect, respecting boundaries that had become more apparent after witnessing her tactical response to armed criminals. Dave's analytical mind had generated theories about Sarah's background that he kept to himself, though his professional interactions now carried subtle deference to expertise that clearly extended beyond mechanical systems. The electrical specialist had recognized patterns in her movements and decision-making that suggested military training, but his respect for her privacy prevented direct inquiry into areas she obviously preferred to keep confidential. Their working relationship had deepened into professional partnership based on mutual recognition of specialized knowledge. Jake's hero worship had evolved into serious attention to instruction that he'd previously dismissed as overcautious methodology from an outdated trainer. The young mechanic now understood that Sarah's emphasis on safety protocols and systematic approaches reflected experience with consequences that extended far beyond workplace injuries or repair mistakes. His eagerness to learn had intensified as he began to grasp that her patient teaching methods transmitted hard-won knowledge about precision under pressure. Tony's gratitude for his employees' protection had grown into protective discretion about Sarah's privacy and background, deflecting media inquiries and discouraging speculation that might compromise whatever circumstances had brought such exceptional capabilities to his small automotive business. The shop owner who had initially hired her based on mechanical competence now appreciated having someone on his staff whose presence provided security that extended far beyond normal workplace considerations. The morning brought Detective Martinez for his weekly check-in, a routine that had developed from his professional curiosity about the mechanic whose tactical response had impressed law enforcement officials throughout the district. His conversations with Sarah remained professionally neutral, though his questions occasionally probed areas that revealed his growing suspicion about her true background and the training that had enabled her dramatic intervention. Their mutual respect was built on unspoken recognition of professional competence that transcended civilian categories. Sarah's response to the detective's attention remained carefully measured, providing cooperation that satisfied law enforcement requirements while maintaining the privacy boundaries that protected her civilian identity. Her answers demonstrated familiarity with investigative procedures that could indicate either extensive civilian training or professional experience with similar situations. The balance she maintained between helpfulness and discretion reflected skills that extended well beyond automotive repair into areas requiring sophisticated judgment. The shop's enhanced security measures had attracted positive attention from insurance companies and business organizations, though Sarah quietly discouraged suggestions that she provide training or consultation to other establishments facing similar threats. Her deflection of such opportunities was consistent with someone seeking to avoid publicity rather than capitalize on temporary fame. The patterns suggested motivations that had nothing to do with financial gain or professional recognition. Customer interactions had evolved to include grateful acknowledgement from community members who appreciated having local heroes protecting neighborhood businesses, though Sarah managed such recognition with gracious modesty that redirected attention to her colleagues' contributions. Her handling of public appreciation demonstrated media awareness and crowd management skills that civilian mechanics wouldn't typically possess, adding to the growing evidence of training that extended far beyond her official background. The criminal's prosecution had proceeded smoothly, with Sarah's testimony providing crucial evidence for conviction, though her court appearances were handled with efficiency that minimized public exposure and media attention. Her familiarity with legal procedures and evidence presentation suggested either extensive civilian involvement with law enforcement or professional experience with similar situations. Defense attorneys had found no vulnerabilities in her testimony or inconsistencies in her account of events. As spring arrived in Phoenix, the industrial district had returned to normal operations with enhanced security awareness that reduced criminal targeting throughout the area. Law enforcement officials credited the dramatic confrontation at Tony's auto repair with disrupting organized robbery activities and deterring similar criminal enterprises. The neighborhood's business community had benefited from one woman's willingness to protect colleagues who had no idea they were working alongside someone whose capabilities extended far beyond automotive expertise. Sarah's evening routine had gradually relaxed as threat assessments returned to baseline levels, though her tactical awareness remained sharper than civilian circumstances typically required. The classified communication equipment in her apartment remained unused, her transition to civilian life successfully maintained despite circumstances that had tested both her cover identity and her commitment to retirement from special operations. 3 years of careful anonymity had survived the crisis without compromising the future she'd worked to build. The final revelation came during a quiet afternoon when Tony discovered Sarah's resignation letter on his desk, professionally written and providing appropriate notice while expressing gratitude for the opportunity to work in his shop. Her explanation cited family circumstances requiring relocation, a plausible story that didn't invite questions about destinations or future plans. The timing suggested that her civilian experiment had reached its natural conclusion. McGill's reaction to news of Sarah's departure included genuine sadness at losing a colleague whose competence and character had earned his deep respect, combined with understanding that someone with her capabilities might have obligations that extended beyond automotive repair. His farewell included heartfelt appreciation for patience with his endless commentary and recognition that her teaching had made him a better mechanic in person. Dave's goodbye carried analytical acknowledgement that Sarah's background remained mysterious despite 3 years of professional collaboration, along with gratitude for expertise that had elevated the shop's technical capabilities and reputation. His respect for her privacy extended to wishes for success in whatever endeavors awaited someone whose qualifications clearly exceeded the requirements of automotive repair work. Jake's emotional farewell reflected the transformation from casual disregard to profound respect for instruction that had prepared him for both professional challenges and unexpected crises. His understanding that Sarah's patient teaching methods had transmitted crucial life skills along with mechanical knowledge would influence his approach to future learning and personal development. Tony's private conversation with Sarah included offers of permanent employment, salary increases, and partnership opportunities that reflected both appreciation for her contributions and hope that financial incentives might retain someone whose presence had transformed his business in ways that extended far beyond mechanical expertise. Her polite decline carried finality that suggested decisions based on considerations he couldn't influence or understand. On her final day, Sarah completed her assigned repairs with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized 3 years of exceptional service, leaving comprehensive documentation for customers and colleagues who would continue maintaining the vehicles she'd restored to perfect operating condition. Her workspace was left immaculately organized, tools arranged with precision that reflected both professional pride and military discipline. The farewell gathering included cake, appreciation speeches, and genuine emotion from colleagues who had discovered that the quiet woman they'd worked alongside possessed depths they were only beginning to appreciate. Sarah's responses carried warmth that had always existed beneath her professional demeanor, along with obvious affection for people who had provided the normalcy she'd sought in civilian life. As Sarah drove away from Tony's auto repair for the final time, her Honda Civic disappeared into Phoenix traffic, carrying someone whose true story would remain known only to herself and classified files that civilian databases couldn't access. Master Sergeant Sarah Chen had successfully completed her transition to civilian life, proving that exceptional individuals could find purpose and satisfaction in ordinary circumstances while maintaining capabilities that distinguished them from everyone around them. The mechanics who had dismissed her worn boots and questioned her experience now understood that appearances meant nothing when true capability revealed itself under pressure. Sometimes the most remarkable people chose unremarkable lives, and sometimes circumstances demanded that hidden strengths emerge to protect those who never suspected they needed protection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.